Every empire in history has operated under the same grand delusion, that their debt is an investment and their currency is immortal. We tell ourselves that the rules of mathematics apply to households and small businesses, but that they somehow bend in the presence of a superpower. We believe that because we have the largest military, the most innovative companies, and the world's reserve currency, we have discovered an escape hatch from the laws of arithmetic. But mathematics has no respect for empires. It does not care about the flags we wave or the speeches given on the floor of the Senate. When the interest on a nation's debt exceeds its ability to pay, the system does not merely suffer a temporary setback or a standard recession. It transforms. It enters a terminal phase where the government is forced to choose between three violent resets: the lie of inflation, the admission of default, or the chaos of external conflict. Today, the United States has crossed a threshold that few are willing to name out loud. The national debt has surpassed $35 trillion. To most people, that number is so large it becomes abstract. It is a figure with 12 zeros that feels more like a distance in light years than a balance sheet. But we can make it concrete. If you were to spend $1 every single second, it would take you more than 1 million years to spend $35 trillion. This is the weight currently resting on the back of the American economy. However, the total debt is not actually the most dangerous number. The more terrifying figure is 1 trillion. That is the amount the United States is now spending every single year just on interest payments. We are paying $1 trillion a year for the privilege of the debt we already have, before we even touch the principal, and before we pay for a single soldier, a single school, or a single mile of highway. This is what economists call the interest death spiral, or more technically, the scissors effect. Imagine a pair of scissors where one blade represents the government's mandatory spending and interest payments, and the other blade represents the tax revenue coming in. For decades, those blades were wide apart. But as the debt grows, the interest blade rises faster and faster. At the same time, as the population ages and economic growth slows, the revenue blade begins to sag. We are now watching those blades close. When they meet, the government loses all discretionary power. We have reached the point where the interest on the debt is now larger than the entire defense budget. We are spending more on the ghost of past spending than we are on the protection of our future. The common refrain from politicians and optimistic pundits is that we will simply grow our way out of it. They point to the post-World War II era when the United States had a massive debt-to-GDP ratio and managed to lower it over the following decades. But that argument ignores a fundamental mathematical reality. In the 1940s and 50s, the United States was the only industrial power left standing. Our GDP growth was explosive, often reaching 5 or 6%, while interest rates were kept artificially low. Today, we are in a debt-saturated economy. When you have $35 trillion in debt, a 1% increase in interest rates eventually adds hundreds of billions of dollars to the annual deficit. If the economy grows at 2% but the interest on the debt is 5%, you are not growing out of the problem. You are sinking deeper into the quicksand with every step you take. The math is finished. The spreadsheets are closed. We are no longer debating if the debt will be paid through traditional means. We are witnessing the beginning of how it will be erased through force, fraud, or failure. To understand where this leads, we have to look back to the first great empire that tried to outrun its own currency, Rome. In the 2nd century after Christ, the Roman Empire was the undisputed master of the known world. Their currency, the silver denarius, was the global standard. It was accepted from the foggy forests of Britain to the spice markets of India. For centuries, the denarius was nearly pure silver, roughly 95%. It was the bedrock of Roman stability. But the empire hit a wall. The era of easy expansion was over. There were no more wealthy kingdoms like Egypt or Dacia left to plunder for gold and silver. At the same time, the costs of maintaining the empire were exploding. The bureaucracy was bloated, the public demanded bread and circuses, and most importantly, the military was becoming increasingly expensive. The Roman state faced a choice that mirrors our own. They could have cut spending, but that would have meant shrinking the military and risking a coup. They could have raised taxes, but the Roman citizens were already taxed to the breaking point. So they chose the third path, the path of the silent default. In the year 64, Emperor Nero became the first to realize that if he couldn't find more silver, he could simply make the silver go further. He began the practice of clipping the coins or mixing the silver with cheaper copper. He reduced the silver content of the denarius to 90%. To the average merchant in the forum, the coin looked the same. It had the emperor's face on it. It was still called a denarius, but the intrinsic value had been stolen by the state. This was the beginning of a 200-year slide into oblivion. At the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the silver content had dropped to 75%. By the middle of the 3rd century, under emperors like Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla, the silver content plummeted to 50%. Caracalla is a particularly important figure in this story because he understood the point of no return. He famously told his mother, "Do not worry about anything else, as long as we have the money to pay the soldiers." He realized that in a debt-trapped empire, the only thing that matters is keeping the men with the swords loyal. To do that, he raised the pay of the legions by 50%. To fund that raise, he didn't find new silver, he simply debased the currency further. By the year 268, the denarius was no longer a silver coin. It was a copper coin with a thin wash of silver on the outside that wore off after a few weeks of use. The silver content was 0.5%. The currency had lost 99% of its value. The results were catastrophic for the ordinary people of Rome. As the money became worthless, prices for basic goods like wheat and oil skyrocketed. History records that a measure of wheat that cost half a denarius in the 1st century cost 200 denarii by the end of the 3rd. The middle class was liquidated. Savings that had been painstakingly built up over generations vanished. The Roman farmer who had saved for his retirement found that his bag of coins could no longer buy a single goat. The state's reaction to this was not to admit fault, but to double down on coercion. Emperor Diocletian, seeing the total collapse of the economy, issued the edict on maximum prices in the year 301. He attempted to use the power of the state to freeze prices and wages by decree. If a merchant charged more than the government-mandated price for a loaf of bread, the penalty was death. But you cannot execute your way out of a mathematical reality. The merchants simply stopped selling bread. The markets went black. People fled the cities because they could no longer afford to eat, moving to the countryside to become serfs on the estates of the wealthy, trading their freedom for a bowl of porridge. This was the birth of feudalism, triggered not by a foreign invasion, but by the death of a currency. The parallel to our modern situation is chillingly precise. Like Rome, the United States has transitioned from an era of productive expansion to an era of fiscal maintenance. We no longer pay for our government through the surplus of our production. We pay for it by devaluing the units of our currency. Since the United States left the gold standard in 1971, the Nixon shock, the dollar has lost more than 85% of its purchasing power. We are clipping the coins at a rate that would make Nero blush, but we do it through digital ledger entries and central bank balance sheets rather than copper alloys. When we talk about $35 trillion in debt, we are talking about a promise that cannot be kept. If the government were to try to pay this debt back through honest taxation, it would require a level of austerity that would trigger a revolution. If they were to simply stop paying, the global financial system, which is built on the foundation of U.S. Treasury bonds, would shatter in an afternoon. This is why the path of Rome, the path of debasement, is the one we are currently walking. It is the path of least political resistance. It allows the politicians to keep making promises and the military to keep receiving its checks, while the cost is quietly siphoned away from the savings and wages of the citizenry. But there is a specific signal that tells us we are reaching the end of this path. In Rome, it was the moment when the state could no longer pay the legions even with debased money. When the soldiers realized they were being paid in worthless tin, they began to auction off the throne to the highest bidder, leading to the crisis of the 3rd century, where 26 different men claimed the title of emperor in just 50 years. Most were assassinated by their own troops. In the modern world, the soldier is the bond market. For decades, the world was happy to lend the United States money at low interest rates because the dollar was as good as gold. But as the debt-to-GDP ratio climbs past 120%, the creditors are starting to get nervous. They are starting to demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk that they will be paid back in clipped coins, dollars, that buy significantly less than the ones they lent. This creates the ultimate trap. If the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight inflation and keep creditors happy, the interest expense on the $35 trillion debt becomes so large that it bankrupts the Treasury. If the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to save the Treasury, inflation runs wild, destroying the value of the dollar and driving creditors away. This is the definition of fiscal dominance. It is the point where the central bank is no longer an independent body managing the economy. It is simply a printing press used to keep the government solvent for one more day. For the ordinary person living through this, the experience is one of constant, grinding confusion. You work harder, you get a raise, but somehow you feel poorer. You look at the price of a home, a car, or a college education, and they seem to be drifting further and further out of reach, regardless of your salary. This is not a failure of your work ethic. It is the silent default in action. Your government is paying its $35 trillion debt by taking a small slice of your purchasing power every single hour of every single day. The Roman citizen in the year 250 didn't wake up and think, the empire is ending today. They woke up and complained that the price of olive oil had gone up again. They complained that the coins felt lighter and looked duller. They wondered why the roads weren't being repaired and why the local garrison seemed more interested in extorting the townspeople than defending the border. They were witnessing the slow-motion collapse of a mathematical system that had reached its limit. We are now standing at that same limit. The scissors are closing. The interest on our debt has crossed the $1 trillion mark. The silver content of our digital denarius is being diluted by trillions of new dollars created out of thin air to bridge the gap between what we have and what we owe. History tells us that this process never stops voluntarily. No empire has ever reached this level of debt and decided to pay it back through sacrifice and frugality. They all chose to print to debase and eventually to reset. As we move forward in this series, we will examine the second path, the hard reset. We will look at what happens when the silent default of inflation isn't enough, and a nation is forced to look its creditors in the eye and say, "We will not pay." We will look at the ruins of Weimar Germany, where the printing presses ran so fast that people used banknotes as wallpaper, and we will see how that economic desperation paved the way for the most destructive war in human history. We will see how the British Empire, once the master of the world's reserve currency, was forced to choose between its global status and its domestic survival. The math of $35 trillion is not just a problem for accountants. It is the story of the end of an era. It is a signal that the patterns of the past are reasserting themselves in the present. The question is not whether the system will change, but which of the three historical paths we will take as the interest-death spiral reaches its conclusion. The Roman denarius didn't fail because of a lack of silver in the world. It failed because the Roman state lacked the discipline to live within its means. The dollar is facing that same reckoning. And just like the Roman merchant or the medieval serf, your future depends on understanding that when the math stops working, the world changes forever. But before we can understand our own future, we have to understand the most extreme version of the silent default ever recorded. We have to look at what happens when the debasement doesn't take 200 years, but happens in a matter of months. We have to look at the moment when money dies entirely. That story begins in the aftermath of the Great War, in a nation that was told it owed a debt that was physically impossible to pay. It is the story of Weimar Germany, and it is the warning of what happens when the lie of inflation is pushed to its absolute breaking point. Transitioning from the slow decay of Rome to the explosive collapse of the 20th century will show us exactly how much time we might have left, and how quickly the end can arrive once the interest trap finally snaps shut. The transition from the slow decay of Rome to the explosive collapse of the 20th century shows us exactly how much time we might have left, and how quickly the end can arrive once the interest trap finally snaps shut. To understand our current $35 trillion predicament, we must move from the world of clipped silver coins to the world of the printing press. While Rome took 3 centuries to debase its currency, modern industrial nations have proven they can achieve the same destruction in less than 3 years. This brings us to the first of the 2 modern paths out of unpayable debt: the explosive, sudden death of a currency known as the silent default. In the early 1920s, the world watched as Weimar Germany became the ultimate laboratory for what happens when a sophisticated, educated, and industrial nation decides to print its way out of a mathematical impossibility. The debt in question was 132 billion gold marks, a sum demanded by the Allies in the 1921 London Schedule of Payments following the First World War. To put this in perspective, this debt was roughly 3 times the size of Germany's entire annual economic output. It was, by every objective measure, unpayable. The German leadership faced a choice that mirrors the one facing modern central bankers. Do you tell the people the truth and endure a catastrophic depression, or do you print the money and hope for a miracle? The German government chose a strategy they called the policy of fulfillment. They decided they would try to pay the debt by any means necessary, which in practice meant the Reichsbank, their version of the Federal Reserve, began printing marks to buy foreign currency to pay the reparations. The head of the Reichsbank at the time was a man named Rudolf Havenstein. Havenstein was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a bureaucrat who believed that his primary job was to provide the state with the liquidity it needed to survive another day. He famously argued that the rising prices were not caused by his printing press, but by the external pressures of the debt itself. If this sounds familiar, it is because it is the exact logic used by modern economists who claim that inflation is caused by supply chain disruptions or corporate greed rather than the expansion of the money supply. The numbers from this period are not just statistics. They are a chronicle of a society's total disintegration. In 1914, before the war, the exchange rate was 4.2 German marks to $1. By the time the reparations hit in 1921, it had slipped to 75 marks per dollar. That was a serious decline, but it was manageable. However, once the mathematical reality of the debt became clear to the markets, the slide turned into a vertical drop. By July 1922, the dollar cost 400 marks. By January 1923, it cost 7,000. By July of that same year, it cost 160,000. And by November 1923, a single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. The human cost of this mathematical collapse was staggering. We often see the photos of children playing with stacks of worthless money like building blocks, or women burning banknotes in stoves because paper was cheaper than firewood. But the deeper tragedy was the total liquidation of the German middle class. These were the people who had done everything right. They were the prudent citizens who had saved their earnings in bank accounts, bought government bonds to support their country, and relied on fixed pensions. In a matter of months, the lifetime savings of a doctor or a professor enough to buy a comfortable home in 1913 could not buy a single egg in 1923. This is the silent default. The government didn't technically refuse to pay its debts. It paid them in full, but it paid them in a currency that had no value. If you owed the government money, you were a winner. If the government owed you money, you were destroyed. This is the ultimate regressive tax. It is a mechanism that transfers wealth from the most productive and responsible members of society to the most indebted institution in existence, the state. The Weimar hyperinflation didn't just break the economy, it broke the social contract. When people realized that their hard work and thrift are being stolen by a printing press, they stopped believing in the system entirely. It is no coincidence that the chaos of 1923 provided the fertile ground for the political extremism that would consume the world a decade later. But hyperinflation is only one way the trap snaps shut. There is a second path, one that is more subtle, more prolonged, and perhaps more relevant to the current trajectory of the United Kingdom and the United States. This is the path of financial repression, and its greatest historical example is the British Empire following the Second World War. In 1945, Britain stood as a victor, but it was a victor that was functionally bankrupt. Its debt-to-GDP ratio had skyrocketed to an incredible 250%. For comparison, the United States today sits at roughly 120%. Britain's debt was so massive that it could never be repaid through traditional taxation. However, unlike Weimar Germany, Britain did not choose the path of immediate hyperinflation. They couldn't. The British pound was still, at that time, a primary reserve currency, and the British elite were desperate to maintain the prestige of the City of London. Instead, they chose the slow bleed. From 1945 until the early 1980s, the British government engaged in a coordinated effort to keep interest rates artificially low while allowing inflation to run consistently higher. This is the core of financial repression. If the government owes a mountain of debt, and that debt carries an interest rate of 2%, but inflation is running at 5%, the real value of that debt is shrinking by 3% every year. It is a way of liquidating debt without the drama of a revolution or the chaos of a wheelbarrow full of cash. But this slow bleed has a devastating price. To make it work, the government must trap its citizens' capital. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Britain implemented strict capital controls. You weren't allowed to just take your money out of the country and invest it in a stronger currency. You were forced to hold British government bonds that paid less than the rate of inflation. It was a mandatory donation to the state's survival. The British people didn't lose their savings overnight like the Germans did in 1923, but they lost them over decades. A generation of British retirees found that the purchasing power of their pensions had been quietly hollowed out, not by a sudden explosion, but by 1,000 small cuts. The consequence of this path was the steady, terminal decline of the British Empire. Because the government was focused entirely on managing its unpayable debt, it had no capital left for innovation or infrastructure. The British pound, which had been the undisputed king of global trade for over a century, began its long, humiliating retreat. The turning point came in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where the world's financial architecture was redesigned. The British representative was the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, but even his brilliance couldn't hide the math. The US dollar, backed by the world's largest gold reserves and a debt-to-GDP ratio that was then only a fraction of Britain's, took the throne. The British path shows us that you can manage a 300% debt-to-GDP ratio, but only by sacrificing your global status and your citizens' prosperity for 40 years. The British went from being the world's banker to being the sick man of Europe, eventually forced to crawl to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout in 1976. This was the ultimate humiliation, the former seat of the global empire having its economic policy dictated by a committee of foreign bureaucrats because it could no longer find anyone willing to lend it money. Now, look at the world today. We are seeing the exact same mechanisms being deployed. When the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates below the rate of inflation, which they have done for much of the last 15 years, they are practicing the British model of financial repression. They are trying to melt the $35 trillion in real terms. But when the government ramps up spending to the point where the central bank must print trillions of dollars in a single year to keep the bond market from collapsing, they are flirting with the Weimar model. The difference today is the speed of information. In 1923, it took time for the news of the Reichsbank's printing to reach every village. In 1945, it took decades for the British public to realize their wealth was being suppressed. Today, every citizen with a smartphone can see the debasement in real time. We can track the M2 money supply, we can see the price of gold hitting all-time highs, and we can see the scissors effect, where the interest on the debt is now larger than the entire defense budget. The interest death spiral is no longer a theoretical projection for the 2040s. It is a line item in the 2024 budget. When the interest on the debt exceeds $1 trillion a year, as it just has, you have entered the final stage of the trap. At this point, the government is borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme, and in the history of finance, no Ponzi scheme has ever been grown out of. It can only be ended through a reset. The question for the modern viewer isn't whether the debt will be paid. It won't be. The question is which of these two historical poisons will be the primary mechanism of the default. Will it be the Weimar fast crash, where a loss of confidence in the dollar leads to a rapid, explosive devaluation? Or will it be the British slow bleed, where we endure decades of stagnant growth, high taxes, and capital controls while our purchasing power is slowly vacuumed away to keep the system on life support? The signals are already appearing. We see the rise of weaponized finance, where the freezing of foreign reserves has told the rest of the world that the dollar is no longer a neutral store of value. We see the push for central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, which would provide the ultimate tool for financial repression, allowing the government to track every transaction and potentially lock capital within the system, just as Britain did with capital controls in the 1950s. History tells us that governments will always choose the path that allows them to survive one more election cycle, even if it guarantees the eventual destruction of the currency. They will choose the lie of inflation over the honesty of a hard default every single time, because a hard default simply saying, "We cannot pay," is a political death sentence. But inflation is a mystery to the average person. As Keynes himself once noted, not one man in a million is able to diagnose the true cause of the price increases that are destroying his life. The middle class in Weimar Germany didn't realize they were being robbed by Rudolf Havenstein until it was too late. The British pensioners didn't realize their empire was being liquidated to pay for the debts of the past until their standard of living had permanently shifted. We have the advantage of their hindsight. We can see that when the debt hits the unpayable threshold, the currency is no longer a tool for trade. It becomes a tool for state survival. As we look at the $35 trillion mountain, we must realize that the mathematical impossibility isn't a future event. It is the current reality. The system is already in a state of silent default. Every time you go to the grocery store and see prices 20 or 30% higher than they were 3 years ago, you are witnessing a portion of that $35 trillion being erased. It isn't being erased from the government's ledgers. It is being erased from your bank account. But there is a third path, one that is even more volatile than inflation or repression. It is the path taken when internal debt becomes so heavy that the state seeks an external reset. It is the path of conflict and the total reorganization of the global order. To understand how debt leads to the guillotine or the battlefield, we have to look at the final days of the French monarchy and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This pattern reveals that when the accountants lose control, the generals usually take over. And that transition, the move from economic crisis to systemic reset, is where the true danger lies. The move from the spreadsheets of the central bank to the chaos of the streets is the most terrifying part of the debt cycle. It is the moment when the interest trap stops being about money and starts being about power. If we are currently walking the path of Weimar's inflation or Britain's decay, we must ask ourselves, what happens when those paths lead to a dead end? History has a chilling answer, and it begins in the halls of Versailles, where a king discovered that no amount of prestige can protect you from a ledger that no longer balances. This realization, that the math always wins in the end, is what we will explore as we look at the third and most violent path out of the debt trap. It is the moment when the interest trap stops being about money and starts being about power. If we are currently walking the path of Weimar's inflation or Britain's decay, we must ask ourselves what happens when those paths lead to a dead end. History has a chilling answer, and it begins in the halls of Versailles, where a king discovered that no amount of prestige can protect you from a ledger that no longer balances. This realization, that the math always wins in the end, is what we will explore as we look at the third and most violent path out of the debt trap. To understand the gravity of $35 trillion, we have to look past the spreadsheets and into the eyes of those who lived through the fourth path. This is the path of internal collapse, social reset, and the total loss of national sovereignty. When we talk about the American debt today, we often treat it as a technical problem for the Federal Reserve to solve with interest rate adjustments or quantitative easing. But history shows that debt is rarely a technical problem. It is a social one. There is a point in the life cycle of every over-leveraged empire where the financial math becomes so broken that it shatters the social contract itself. This is exactly what happened in France during the 1780s. Most people remember the French Revolution for the guillotine and the storming of the Bastille, but they forget that the fuse was lit by a sovereign debt crisis that looks hauntingly familiar to our own. By 1788, the French state was spending over 50% of its entire tax revenue just to service the interest on its debt. They weren't even paying down the principal. They were simply trying to keep the lights on. The roots of this crisis were decades in the making, fueled by the 7 Years' War and France's massive financial support for the American Revolution. King Louis XVI found himself in a mathematical cage. He couldn't grow the economy fast enough to outpace the interest, and he couldn't print money because France didn't have a modern central bank like the Bank of England. The debt was real, it was denominated in gold and silver, and the interest was compounding at rates between 8 and 10%, nearly triple what the British were paying at the time. This leads us to the figure of Jacques Necker, the Director General of Finance. Necker was the ultimate accountant-politician. In 1781, he published the Compte Rendu au Roi, the first public disclosure of the king's finances. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting. Necker wanted to reassure creditors, so he hid the massive war expenses and showed a small surplus in the ordinary budget. It worked for a while, allowing France to borrow even more money at slightly lower rates. But you cannot hide the truth from the ledger forever. When the real numbers eventually leaked, the shock destroyed the crown's credibility. The social deadlock that followed is the fourth path in its purest form. The French society was divided into 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. The nobility held the vast majority of the wealth, yet they were legally exempt from most taxes. They argued that their service to the state was military and social, not financial. Meanwhile, the peasantry and the burgeoning middle class, the third estate, were already taxed to the point of starvation. When Louis XVI tried to reform the system to tax the wealthy, the nobility used their legal power to block him. They were more concerned with protecting their immediate privileges than saving the system that granted them those privileges. This is the fiscal deadlock. It is what happens when a nation's debt is so large that any attempt to pay it off requires a sacrifice that no segment of society is willing to make. The wealthy won't accept higher taxes, the poor can't survive any more cuts to services, and the middle class is being hollowed out by the silent tax of inflation. In 1789, this deadlock broke. The king was forced to call the Estates General, a legislative body that hadn't met in over 100 years. He hoped they would find a way to approve new taxes. Instead, he handed a microphone to a population that was hungry, angry, and aware that the king was bankrupt. Within months, the financial crisis had transformed into a total systemic reset. The debt wasn't paid. It was erased by the total destruction of the old order. The people didn't just want a new tax code, they wanted a new world. When we look at the United States today, we see the same scissors effect that Necker faced. Mandatory spending on Social Security, Medicare, and interest is growing at an exponential rate, while tax receipts are struggling to keep pace with even the most optimistic GDP growth. We are entering a period where the political class is paralyzed. Any suggestion of cutting spending is met with electoral suicide, and any suggestion of meaningful tax increases on the scale required to bridge the gap would trigger a capital flight or a deep recession. We are in the deadlock. And as the French found out, when the math becomes impossible, the politics becomes violent. But there is another way a nation loses control when it drowns in debt, one that doesn't involve a guillotine but is equally devastating. This is the path of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. In the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. To fund modernization and a series of expensive wars, including the Crimean War, the Sultan began borrowing heavily from European bankers in London and Paris. Between 1854 and 1874, the empire issued 15 different major loans. They were addicted to the flow of foreign capital. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire reached the mathematical end of the road. They defaulted on their debt, unable to even pay the interest. This wasn't a silent default through inflation because their debt was owed to foreign powers in foreign currencies. You can't print your way out of a debt that is owed in someone else's money. For 6 years, the empire drifted in financial limbo until 1881, when the Sultan was forced to sign the Decree of Muharrem. This decree is one of the most sobering documents in economic history. To prevent a total military invasion by its creditors, the Ottoman Empire agreed to hand over its financial sovereignty. They created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA. This was a body of 7 delegates representing the foreign bondholders. This organization was given the legal right to collect taxes directly from Ottoman citizens. They took control of the taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, spirits, and even the fishing industry. Think about the implications of that. A foreign agency, beholden only to international bankers, had its own tax collectors standing on the docks and in the marketplaces of Istanbul, taking the people's money before the Sultan's own government could touch it. The OPDA eventually grew to have 5,000 employees, more than the Ottoman Ministry of Finance itself. The empire still had a flag, a sultan, and an army, but it was no longer a sovereign nation. It was a debt collection colony. This is the warning for the 21st century. While the United States currently enjoys the privilege of borrowing in its own currency, that privilege is not a law of nature. It is a function of trust and global hegemony. When a nation loses the ability to manage its own debt, its creditors, whether they are foreign nations or international institutions, eventually demand more than just interest. They demand control. We see echoes of the Decree of Muharrem today in the structural adjustment programs imposed on developing nations by the IMF, where a country is forced to sell off its national assets and gut its social programs to satisfy foreign bondholders. The question for America is, what happens when the sick man is the world's largest economy? This brings us to the underlying mechanism that bridges these historical tragedies to our modern reality, the concept of fiscal dominance. This is a term that every person with a savings account needs to understand. In a healthy economy, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is independent. It sets interest rates to control inflation and maintain a stable currency. But fiscal dominance, occurs when the government's debt and deficit spending are so massive that the central bank can no longer act independently. Imagine the Fed wants to raise interest rates to fight inflation, which is its primary job. But if it raises rates to 5%, the interest expense on $35 trillion of debt becomes so high that it consumes the entire federal budget, triggering an immediate bankruptcy of the government. In this scenario, the Fed is trapped. It cannot raise rates because the government can't afford the interest. Instead, it is forced to keep rates artificially low and print money to buy the government's debt. This is the moment the central bank ceases to be a guardian of the currency and becomes the printing press of last resort for a bankrupt state. This is exactly where the United States finds itself today. We are witnessing the end of central bank independence. When the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve begin to operate as a single unit, their goal is no longer price stability. Their goal is regime survival. They will sacrifice the purchasing power of your wages and the value of your savings to ensure the government can continue to make its interest payments. In the 1780s, the French didn't have this option, so they had a revolution. In the 1920s, the Germans did have this option, so they had hyperinflation. In the 1880s, the Ottomans had foreign debt, so they lost their sovereignty. The United States is currently attempting a mix of all three, but the gravity of the math is pulling us toward a singular point. Let's look at the human cost of this mathematical inevitability. What does it look like for the ordinary person when a nation enters the fourth path of internal conflict and social reset? It starts with the breakdown of the most basic services. In the final years of the Ottoman Empire and the dying days of the French monarchy, the state could no longer pay its soldiers, its clerks, or its police. When the protectors of the state are no longer being paid in a currency that can buy bread, they stop protecting the state. In pre-revolutionary France, the price of a loaf of bread went from a few sous to the equivalent of a week's wages in a matter of months. This wasn't just because of a bad harvest. It was because the currency was collapsing and the state's credit was gone. The average person didn't care about debt-to-GDP ratios or sovereign credit spreads. They cared that their children were hungry while the elites in Versailles were arguing over who should pay the interest on the king's loans. This is where the internal conflict path becomes inevitable. When the gap between the debt class, those who live off the interest and the government's largesse, and the working class, those who pay the taxes and suffer the inflation becomes a chasm, the social fabric tears. We are seeing the early symptoms of this today in the rising polarization and the total lack of trust in every major institution. When people realize that the system is rigged to protect the ledger at the expense of their lives, they stop following the rules of that system. The Ottoman merchant in 1882 saw his taxes being shipped off to London and Paris while the roads in his own city crumbled. He saw that his hard work was no longer benefiting his community or his country. It was being sucked out by a global financial machine that didn't care if he lived or died. This leads to a profound sense of nihilism and a loss of national identity. Why be a citizen of a country that is nothing more than a debt-servicing vehicle? The fourth path is the reset that happens when all the lies, all the accounting tricks, and all the silent defaults have been exhausted. It is the moment when the people realize that the $35 trillion isn't just a number on a screen, it is a claim on their future, their children's labor, and their country's soul. And they decide they aren't going to pay it. This leads us to a terrifying modern realization. We have built a global financial system that is more interconnected than anything the French or the Ottomans could have imagined. In 1789, a French collapse stayed mostly in France. In 1881, the Ottoman default was managed by a handful of European banks. But today, the US dollar is the foundation of the entire world's economy. If the US enters a period of fiscal dominance, where it must choose between government survival and the value of the dollar, the consequences won't be localized. They will be planetary. We are currently watching the interest death spiral in real time. In 2024, the interest on the US debt crossed the $1 trillion mark. That is more than we spend on our entire military. It is more than we spend on almost any other single category of government activity. And because we are running $2 trillion deficits every year, that interest expense isn't just growing, it is accelerating. We are borrowing money to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. This is the definition of a Ponzi scheme, and like all Ponzi schemes, it requires an ever-increasing flow of new investors to keep from collapsing. But what happens when the investors stop coming? What happens when the world looks at the $35 trillion ledger and realizes that there is no combination of taxes or growth that can ever make it whole? This is where we see the transition to weaponized finance and the loss of sovereignty. Just as the Ottoman Empire was forced to hand over its tax revenue, we are seeing the modern equivalent in the way the global financial system is being restructured. When the United States froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, it sent a shockwave through the world. It signaled to every nation that their savings in US dollars were not actually theirs. They were a permission-based asset. This has accelerated the de-dollarization trend. Nations like China, India, and Brazil are looking at the US debt and the US use of the dollar as a weapon, and they are realizing that they don't want to be the bondholders of a bankrupt and unpredictable empire. They are looking for the exit. As these foreign buyers leave the market for US treasuries, the Federal Reserve is forced to step in and buy more of the debt itself. This is the fiscal dominance mechanism in action. The Fed is becoming the only buyer of the government's debt, which means the Fed is printing the money that the government is spending. This is the exact path that Weimar Germany took. It is the exact path that leads to the destruction of the middle class. The fourth path of conflict and reset is not a choice that a nation makes. It is a destiny that it earns. We have earned it through decades of promising ourselves things we couldn't afford and assuming that the privilege of our currency would last forever. But history shows that the math is a jealous God. It does not care about our political debates or our exceptionalism. It only cares that the ledger balances. What happened to the ordinary person in these scenarios? In France, they got a revolution, and then a Napoleon, a strongman who promised order but delivered 20 years of continental war. In the Ottoman Empire, they got a slow, agonizing decline that ended in the total dismemberment of their nation after World War I. In both cases, the generation that lived through the debt peak saw their world transformed beyond recognition. Their savings were gone, their social structures were shattered, and the certainty of their lives was replaced by a brutal struggle for survival. We are now standing at the edge of that same transformation. The $35 trillion is the weight of a world that is about to break. But to understand how this ends for us, we have to look at the modern signals. We have to look at how the system is trying to pivot to avoid the guillotine while keeping the debt alive. We have to look at the rise of new technologies and new control mechanisms that the kings and sultans of the past could only dream of. The interest trap is closing. We have seen how empires try to inflate their way out, how they default, and how they collapse from within. But there is a final layer to this story, the modern paradox. We are currently in a state of deadlock that mirrors the 1780s, but we have the tools of the 21st century. As we move into the next part of this exploration, we will look at the three signals that suggest which path America is currently taking. We will look at yield curve control, the weaponization of finance, and the rise of central bank digital currencies as the ultimate tools for a new kind of financial repression. History is not just a series of dates, it is a series of warnings. The warning of the fourth path is that once the math becomes unpayable, the only thing left is the reset. And the reset is never peaceful. It is a fundamental rewriting of who owns what, who owes what, and who is in charge. As the interest payments on our debt climb toward $2 trillion and beyond, we are no longer waiting for the crisis. We are living in it. The only question left is how much of our world will survive the transformation. This realization that we are in the middle of a systemic shift that happens only once every few centuries is what makes this moment so urgent. We aren't just talking about a recession or a market correction. We are talking about the end of a 500-year era of Western financial dominance. The accountant has arrived, and he is looking at the $35 trillion with a cold, unwavering eye. The ledger must be cleared, and as we will see, the way it gets cleared will change everything you thought you knew about money, power, and your own future. The patterns are clear. The mechanism of fiscal dominance is already engaged. The social deadlock is visible in every headline. The loss of sovereignty is beginning as the world looks for alternatives to the dollar. We are no longer in the realm of if. We are in the realm of how and when. The path of internal conflict and social reset is the most painful, but it is also the most common for empires that refuse to face the truth of their own bankruptcy. As we look toward the modern implications, we must ask ourselves, if we are indeed in the 1780s of the American experiment, what comes after the Bastille falls? The answer lies in the Triffin dilemma and the unique role of the US dollar. It is our greatest strength, but it is also the ultimate trap that prevents us from choosing a simpler path. To understand the future, we must understand why the dollar is both the armor and the poison of the American empire. That is where we turn next, as we apply these historical patterns to the world of today and the great debasement that is already underway. We have arrived at the paradox of the golden cage. To understand why $35 trillion in debt is not just a high number but a structural prison, we have to look at the very thing that makes America powerful: the United States dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. For decades, we have been told this is our exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s. It meant the United States could print money to buy real goods from the rest of the world, and the world would simply hold those pieces of paper as savings. But history shows us that every privilege eventually becomes a burden, and every armor eventually becomes a weight that drowns the wearer. We are now entering the final stage of what economists call the Triffin dilemma, and the implications for your savings, your sovereignty, and your future are absolute. In 1960, a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin stood before Congress and delivered a chilling prophecy. He argued that the country whose currency serves as the world's reserve is doomed to a mathematical death. To keep global trade moving, the United States must provide the world with dollars. But there is only one way to get those dollars into the hands of foreign central banks. The United States must run constant, massive trade deficits. We must buy more than we sell. We must export our currency and import their goods. If the United States ever stopped running deficits, global liquidity would dry up, trade would freeze, and the world would fall into a depression. However, Triffin warned that by running these perpetual deficits, the United States would inevitably see its own gold reserves dwindle and its debt-to-GDP ratio explode until the world finally lost confidence in the dollar's value. It is a heads-they-win, tails-we-lose scenario. For 60 years, we chose the path of providing liquidity, and today, that $35 trillion debt is the literal manifestation of Triffin's trap. We have reached the point where the world has more dollars than it wants, and the United States has more debt than it can ever hope to service without destroying the currency itself. This leads us to the first modern warning signal, the shift from the dollar as a utility to the dollar as a weapon. For the better part of the last century, the dollar was seen as a neutral tool for trade, much like the British pound was in the 19th century. But in February 2022, the game changed forever. When the United States and its allies froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, they didn't just punish a nation, they broke the fundamental trust of the global financial system. Every central bank in the world, from Beijing to Riyadh to New Delhi, watched that event and realized that their savings were not actually theirs. They were merely permissions granted by the United States Treasury. If you hold your wealth in another country's currency, you are a tenant, not an owner. This has accelerated a trend known as de-dollarization, a movement that is no longer a fringe conspiracy theory, but a stated policy of the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which recently expanded to include oil giants like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The historical parallel here is the Suez Crisis of 1956. At that time, Great Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious. He didn't send troops to stop the British. He used the financial nuclear option. He threatened to sell off the United States' massive holdings of British pound sterling bonds, which would have collapsed the British economy overnight. London folded within days. That was the moment the British Empire truly ended, not because they lost a battle, but because they realized they no longer controlled their own currency's fate. Today, the United States is finding itself on the other side of that equation. As nations like China and Japan reduce their holdings of U.S. treasuries, the buyer of last resort is disappearing. This is why the debt is becoming unpayable. In the past, we could always find a foreign country to lend us money at low interest rates. Now, those countries are buying gold or trading in their own currencies. This leaves the Federal Reserve as the only entity left to buy the debt, which brings us back to the silent default of the printing press. As the pool of willing buyers for American debt shrinks, the government faces a terrifying reality. Interest rates should, by all laws of physics, skyrocket. If you have a borrower who is $35 trillion in the hole and his customers are leaving, you demand a higher interest rate to compensate for the risk. But if interest rates on $35 trillion rise to even 6 or 7%, The interest payments alone would consume every single dollar of federal tax revenue. The schools would close, the military would sit idle, and the social security checks would stop. To prevent this, the government will be forced to implement what is known as yield curve control, or YCC. This is the second modern signal to watch. We have seen this before. In 1942, as the United States was financing World War II, the debt was exploding. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury entered into a formal agreement to cap interest rates. They decided that no matter what happened, they would not let the yield on the 10-year Treasury note rise above 2.5%. If investors tried to sell their bonds and push rates higher, the Fed would simply step in and print as much money as necessary to buy every single bond on the market. It worked for a while, keeping the government solvent through the war. But the cost was a massive surge in inflation during the late 1940s. Ordinary Americans saw the price of milk, bread, and cars double, while their savings in the bank earned a measly 2%. This is financial repression. It is a way for the government to stay solvent by making you, the saver, poorer every single day. We are seeing the whispers of this today as the Fed struggles to balance its fight against inflation with the government's need for cheap debt. Eventually, the government's need for survival will win, and the Fed will be forced to cap rates, effectively sacrificing your purchasing power to keep the Treasury afloat. But the modern era has a tool that the Romans and the British never had: the technology of total surveillance. This brings us to the third signal, the rise of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. In a world of physical cash, people can escape financial repression. If the bank offers you 0% interest while inflation is 10%, you can withdraw your paper money and put it under a mattress or buy gold. This leakage prevents the government from fully capturing your wealth to pay off its debts. CBDCs solve this problem for the state. If the currency is entirely digital and held in an account directly with the central bank, the government can implement negative interest rates with a single line of code. They can literally deduct money from your account every month to force you to spend and stimulate the economy. They can program the money so it can only be spent on certain goods, or ensure it expires if not used by a certain date. This is the ultimate tool for debt absorption. By trapping every citizen inside a closed digital loop, the state can ensure that the silent default is total and inescapable. It is the modern version of the Ottoman Empire's Decree of Muharrem, where the creditors didn't just take the tax money, they took control of the very mechanism of the economy. While these technical mechanisms are being prepared, the social and political atmosphere is beginning to mirror one of the most volatile periods in human history, pre-revolutionary France in the 1780s. People often think the French Revolution was caused by a lack of bread, but the bread shortage was merely the spark. The fuel was an unpayable national debt. After decades of fighting expensive wars, including the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, the French crown was bankrupt. The interest on the debt was consuming more than half of the national budget. King Louis XVI was not a tyrant. By historical standards, he was a reformer. He knew the system was broken. He hired brilliant accountants like Jacques Necker to find a way out. Necker's conclusion was simple. The nobility and the church, who owned most of the wealth, had to start paying taxes, but the French political system was in a state of mathematical deadlock. The nobility controlled the courts and the local governments, and they refused to give up their exemptions. The peasantry and the rising middle class, known as the Third Estate, were already taxed to the point of starvation. There was no middle ground because the debt had grown so large that any solution required someone to be completely wiped out. The elites wouldn't budge, and the people couldn't pay. This is the exact situation we see in the United States today. We are told the solution is to tax the rich or cut spending, but the math says neither is enough. If you confiscated every penny from every billionaire in America, it wouldn't even cover the deficit for a single year. If you cut every discretionary program, the FBI, the parks, the roads, the schools, you still wouldn't balance the budget because of the mandatory spending on interest, Social Security, and Medicare. We are in the 1780s France deadlock. The political theater we watch on the news is a distraction from the fact that no legislative exit exists. When a system reaches this point of mathematical impossibility, it stops being a debate about policy and starts being a struggle for survival. In France, that struggle led to the calling of the Estates General in 1789, the first time that body had met in 175 years. It was an admission that the existing government had failed. Within months, the entire social order was overturned. The debt didn't go away. It was simply erased through the total destruction of the old regime and the issuance of a new, soon-to-be-worthless paper currency called the assignat. For the ordinary person living through these modern implications, the experience isn't usually one of a single, sudden crash. It is a feeling of being squeezed from all sides. It is the realization that despite working longer hours and getting raises, you are falling further behind. It is shrinkflation, where the price stays the same but the package gets smaller. It is the housing crisis, where homes are no longer shelters but assets used by the wealthy to hide from the debasement of the currency. It is the sense that the rules have changed, but no one told you. In the 1920s, the German middle class felt this same bewilderment. They had done everything right. They saved, they worked, they were prudent, and yet they were the ones who were destroyed, while the speculators and the government-connected elites thrived. This is the great debasement in real time. We are watching the transition from a world where the dollar was a store of value to a world where it is a hot potato that everyone wants to pass to someone else as quickly as possible. When you see the price of gold hitting all-time highs or the rise of alternative assets like Bitcoin, you aren't seeing investments going up. You are seeing the denominator going down. You are seeing the market's attempt to find an exit from the Triffin trap. The signal is clear. The era of risk-free assets is over. For 80 years, a U.S. Treasury bond was considered the safest thing on earth. Today, it is a return-free risk. It is a promise from a government that is mathematically incapable of keeping its promises without printing the difference. As we look toward the final path, we must realize that history doesn't just offer us warnings, it offers us a playbook. The patterns of Rome, Weimar, Britain, and France are converging on this single point in time. The $35 trillion is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be navigated. The institutions we have trusted to protect our wealth, the banks, the pension funds, the central banks, are the very ones most entangled in the debt trap. They are the ones who will be forced to absorb the losses when the yield curve control or the silent default reaches its crescendo. But what happens when the silent default isn't enough? What happens when the internal deadlock of the 1780s France parallel becomes so intense that the system can no longer hold itself together through printing alone? History shows there is one final, more violent path that empires take when their ledgers no longer balance and their people are at each other's throats. It is the path that resets the clock, erases the debts, and redraws the maps of the world. It is the path of external conflict and the great reset of war. As we move into the final part of this journey, we will look at the darkest of the three paths, how it has been used throughout history to cleanse the balance sheets of dying empires, and most importantly, what you must do right now to protect your family, your assets, and your future before the window of opportunity closes forever. The math is finished. The transformation has begun. We are now entering the endgame. The math is finished. The transformation has begun. We are now entering the endgame, a period where the abstract numbers on a central bank balance sheet manifest as concrete realities in your daily life. When a nation crosses the threshold of $35 trillion in debt, the conversation shifts from fiscal policy to personal survival. History is a relentless teacher, and it tells us that when the systemic reset arrives, it does not ask for permission. It simply happens. To navigate what is coming, you must abandon the financial assumptions of the last 40 years and adopt the Great Debasement Playbook, a strategy used by the wise and the wary throughout every era of imperial decline. The first and most vital lesson from the archives of collapse is the transition from paper to hard assets. We have been conditioned to believe that a digital number in a bank account or a government bond is the ultimate expression of safety. But history suggests these are merely promises to pay, and when a government is bankrupt, a promise is the first thing to be broken. Consider the year 1795 in revolutionary France. The government had issued assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands. At first, they were treated like gold, but as the debt spiraled, the printing presses ran day and night. By 1796, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. Those who held the paper were destitute, watching as their life savings became literal kindling. However, those who had seen the mathematical writing on the wall and exchanged their paper for sachwart, or real values, productive farmland, gold coins, and physical tools found that their purchasing power remained intact. In the eyes of the state, the debt was cleared through the destruction of the currency. In the eyes of the prepared, wealth was simply moved from a failing vessel to a stable one. This brings us to the fundamental strategy of wealth protection, the move towards scarcity. In the modern era, we are witnessing a fascinating historical rhyme through the rise of digital scarcity. For 2,000 years, gold was the only denarius that could not be debased by a desperate emperor. When Emperor Septimius Severus began reducing the silver content of the Roman currency in the late 2nd century, the merchants of the empire didn't stop trading. They simply started demanding more denarii for the same loaf of bread. They were instinctively adjusting for the loss of hard value. Today, we see the same impulse driving the adoption of Bitcoin and other decentralized assets. These are the modern equivalents of the pre-debasement Roman aureus. While the Federal Reserve can create trillions of dollars with a keystroke, no king, president, or central banker can manifest more than 21 million Bitcoin. This is not a technological trend. It is a historical reflex. It is the human instinct to seek a unit of account that is outside the reach of the state's printing press. Just as the wealthy families of the 17th century Dutch Republic moved their capital into landed estates, when the maritime empire began to fray, the modern individual is seeking digital land that cannot be taxed away through the silent theft of inflation. To survive the endgame of a $35 trillion debt, you must undergo a psychological shift. You must stop thinking in terms of accumulating currency and start thinking in terms of preserving purchasing power. This is a distinction that most people fail to make until it is too late. In the Weimar Republic of 1923, there were technically more millionaires than at any point in German history. On paper, everyone was rich. But when 1,000,000 marks can't buy a single egg, the term millionaire becomes a cruel joke. The people who survived the Weimar hyperinflation were not those who had the most marks, but those who understood the real price of things. They measured their wealth in ounces of silver, in bushels of wheat, or in the number of hours of labor their assets could command. When the dollar is being debased at a rate that exceeds the interest you earn in a savings account, that account is not a safe haven, it is a melting ice cube. You must look at your personal balance sheet and ask, if the currency were reset tomorrow, what would I own that still has utility to another human being? A government bond has no utility if the government cannot pay. A digital bank balance has no utility if the network is frozen. But a house, a gold bar, a patent, or a skill, these are the hard foundations that survive the storm. We must also address the dangerous trap of personal leverage. In an inflationary environment, the conventional wisdom is that debt is a gift. If you owe $100,000 and the currency loses half its value, your debt has effectively been cut in half. This was the strategy used by industrialist Hugo Stinnes during the German collapse of the 1920s. He borrowed massive amounts of paper marks to buy up real physical assets, mines, ships, and factories. When the currency crashed, his debts vanished, and he became the richest man in Germany. However, this strategy is a double-edged sword. If the government chooses the path of deflationary default or explicit default, as we saw during the Great Depression of 1929, the opposite happens. As the money supply shrinks, the real value of your debt explodes. When the dollar becomes scarce, your mortgage stays the same, but your income vanishes. This is why the financial historian playbook suggests a radical reduction in personal leverage before the systemic reset. When the system deleverages, it does so violently. Being debt-free is not just a financial goal, it is a form of strategic autonomy. It means that when the state begins to squeeze its citizens for every last drop of revenue through wealth taxes or windfall levies, you have no chains that allow them to pull you down. The final thesis of this crisis is that the $35 trillion debt will not be paid with a check. It will be erased through a total systemic transformation that will redefine the very nature of money. We are moving toward an era of financial repression, a term coined by economists Carmen Reinhart and Belén Esperanza to describe how governments dealt with the massive debts of World War II. They kept interest rates artificially low while allowing inflation to run hot, effectively liquidating the debt at the expense of savers. This is the slow bleed. However, because our current debt is so much larger and our demographics so much older than in 1945, the slow bleed may not be enough. This points toward the introduction of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. These are not just digital dollars, they are programmable tools of control. In a CBDC system, the government could theoretically expire your savings to force spending, or apply negative interest rates directly to your wallet to pay down the national debt. This is the ultimate Ottoman path where the creditor, the state, takes total control over the tax office of your life. To protect yourself, you must ensure that a portion of your wealth exists outside the wire. This means physical assets, offshore jurisdictions, and decentralized protocols that do not require a central authority's permission to function. As we look at the historical precedents, from the Decree of Muharrem in the Ottoman Empire to the Nixon shock of 1971, a clear pattern emerges. Every empire reaches a point where the math no longer works. They all try to lie, then they try to print, and finally they are forced to reset. We are currently in the printing phase, transitioning rapidly into the reset. The ordinary people who were ruined in these transitions were almost always those who believed the official narrative. They believed the Roman denarius was still silver when it was mostly copper. They believed the French assignat was as good as land. They believed the British pound would always be the world's reserve currency. The survivors were those who looked at the math, not the propaganda. They saw that the interest on the debt was growing faster than the economy's ability to pay it, and they acted accordingly. This is not a message of despair, but of clarity. The $35 trillion debt is a mathematical certainty that will find its resolution. You cannot vote away the laws of arithmetic. You cannot wish away the interest death spiral, but you can choose which side of the ledger you want to be on when the transformation occurs. You can be a creditor to a bankrupt system, holding its paper promises, or you can be an owner of the real world, holding the assets that humanity will always need, regardless of what name is printed on the currency. The greatest risk you face is not the collapse of the dollar. It is the belief that this time is different. It is the belief that for the first time in 5,000 years, a nation has found a way to borrow forever without consequence. History tells us otherwise. It tells us that the golden age of easy credit and unpayable debt is a brief anomaly, a flicker in the long timeline of human civilization. We are now returning to the mean. We are returning to a world where money must be earned, where scarcity is real, and where the promises of kings are worth exactly what they can be exchanged for in the marketplace. The Great Debasement is not a future event. It is the water we are currently swimming in. The signals are everywhere, in the rising price of gold, in the volatility of the bond market, and in the quiet de-dollarization occurring across the global south. The world is preparing for the post-dollar era. The question is, are you? Take stock of your personal balance sheet today. Reduce your reliance on systemic leverage. Move your wealth from paper to hard. And most importantly, educate yourself on the patterns of the past, because they are the only reliable map for the future. Debt will be erased one way or another. Whether it is erased through the silent default of inflation, the hard reset of a new currency, or the external conflict that resets the global board, the outcome for the unprepared will be the same. But for those who understand that mathematics has no respect for empires, this transformation is not an end, but a beginning. It is the moment where true value is rediscovered, and where the prudent are rewarded for their foresight. The spreadsheets are closed. The math is finished. The only thing left to decide is how you will stand when the curtain falls on the age of debt. History is repeating itself, not as a tragedy or a farce, but as a mathematical inevitability. The patterns are clear, the precedents are set, and the endgame is here. The greatest wealth transfer in human history is not coming. It has already begun. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.